You're not going to believe this one. Imagine you're sitting at home, enjoying a quiet Saturday morning, maybe sipping on your coffee, when suddenly you hear this loud screeching sound outside. At first, you think maybe it's just a delivery truck slamming on the brakes or kids riding their bikes too fast. But no, when you look outside, your jaw literally drops. Because there's a car plowed halfway into your neighbor's yard, flattening the flowers, the mailbox knocked clean off, and right in the driver's seat, none other than Karen. Yeah, that Karen, the neighborhood's self-appointed queen, the one who treats every street like her personal kingdom and every neighbor like her loyal subject. Only this time, her royal chariot didn't exactly land gracefully. It crash-landed like a bad reality TV show moment. And here's the kicker. She doesn't even get out of the car. She just sits there, engine running, like nothing happened. Like crashing into someone's property was part of her morning errands. Now here's where it gets insane. The neighbor whose yard she crashed into, let's call him Dan, comes running out, still in his slippers, holding a piece of toast in his hand because he was literally in the middle of breakfast. His face? Priceless. Equal parts shock, anger, and the "why me, Lord?" expression. He rushes up to her car window, knocks on it, and says, "Karen, you need to get out of the car. You just drove into my yard." And she, without missing a beat, rolls down her window and says, "It's not my fault. Your yard was too close to the road." Excuse me? What? Who even says that? That's like saying, "I didn't spill my drink. Your cup was in the way." The logic is pure Karen. And Dan, poor guy, is standing there completely dumbfounded. He tries again, more firm this time. "Karen, you need to step out of the car." And she just refuses, shakes her head, mutters something about not feeling safe to get out, and then goes back to scrolling on her phone like she didn't just turn his rose garden into a demolition derby. At this point, a small crowd of neighbors starts gathering. You know how it is. When something dramatic happens in a neighborhood, suddenly everyone who's usually too busy to say hello has time to come outside. People are whispering, taking pictures. One guy across the street is already live streaming on Facebook, because of course he is. And Karen? She's still sitting there like the star of her own show, windows up, car still humming, acting like she's the victim. Now let me pause right here, because if you've ever dealt with someone like this, you know the mix of emotions that come up. First, disbelief like, is this really happening right now? Then frustration. Why can't she just admit she messed up? And finally, that simmering anger, because people like Karen have this magical ability to make everyone else suffer for their mistakes. And believe me, this was just the beginning of her circus act. Dan, bless his heart, tries a different tactic. He pulls out his phone and says, "All right, Karen, if you won't get out, I'm calling the cops." Now most people, when they hear the words "calling the cops," they suddenly rethink their life choices. Not Karen. She leans out the window and says, "Go ahead. They'll see this is your fault, not mine." And then she smirks. That smirk, the universal Karen trademark, the one that says, "I've gotten away with nonsense before, and I'll do it again." And honestly, if I was in Dan's shoes, I probably would have lost it. But here's the funny thing. This whole scene actually reminded me of something that happened to me a few years ago. I didn't have a Karen crash into my yard, thank God. But I did have a neighbor once back my car out of the driveway straight into my mailbox. And when I confronted him, he shrugged and said, "Well, your mailbox was too close to the road." Déjà vu, right? Some people just refuse to accept reality. And when you combine that with a Karen attitude, you've basically got yourself a Netflix drama waiting to happen. Anyway, back to the story. The cops eventually show up, lights flashing, sirens blaring, and the whole neighborhood is basically gathered like it's Friday night entertainment. Karen rolls her window down an inch, just an inch, mind you, and starts telling the officer how Dan intimidated her and made her feel unsafe. Meanwhile, the officer is staring at the giant tire tracks in the yard, the smashed mailbox, the bent garden gnome, and you can just see him trying not to laugh. "Ma'am," he says, "we need you to step out of the vehicle." And Karen, dead serious, says, "No, I don't trust this neighborhood. Everyone here is against me." Lady, you literally just bulldozed through someone's begonias. Yeah, people might not be thrilled. By this point, the crowd is giggling, phones are up, someone yells, "World star," and Karen is digging herself deeper into the pit she created. The officer gives her a final warning. And when she still refuses, guess what happens? Yep, they open the door themselves. And the look on her face when she realized she was no longer in control? Pure gold. Karen's refusal to get out of the car had already turned the neighborhood into a full-on reality show. But once the officer opened her door, that's when the chaos really kicked off. She clutched the steering wheel like it was a lifeline, digging her nails in, refusing to budge. The officer leaned down and said, "Ma'am, this isn't optional. You need to step out." And Karen, in true Karen fashion, screeched, "This is harassment. I know my rights. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever someone yells, I know my rights." After plowing through a garden gnome, it usually means they actually don't know their rights at all. The crowd of neighbors watching started whispering and snickering. Someone in the back even muttered, "Cue the meltdown," like they were narrating a documentary. The second officer, clearly tired of the theatrics, reached in, unbuckled her seatbelt, and gently but firmly pulled her out of the car. Karen made this dramatic gasp, like she was being kidnapped by aliens. "Help! They're assaulting me. Someone record this," she shrieked. And of course, 20 phones were already pointed at her, recording every second. She wanted attention. Well, she got it. Meanwhile, poor Dan was still standing there in his slippers, arms crossed, trying not to explode. His yard looked like a monster truck rally had come through. His roses, gone. His mailbox, gone. His favorite garden gnome, the one he said his kids gave him for Father's Day, lay decapitated on the lawn. And the woman responsible was now yelling at police officers like she was the one wronged. "Karen," Dan said, voice trembling with anger, "you're paying for this." She shot him a look so sharp it could have cut glass. "I'm not paying a dime. If anything, you owe me for emotional distress." That was it. The crowd erupted in laughter. Even the officer stifled a chuckle. At this point, the situation had turned from shocking to downright ridiculous. Karen was pacing the sidewalk, pointing fingers at everyone like she was about to fire half the neighborhood. "You've all been against me since day one. This is a conspiracy," she cried out. A kid from 2 houses down whispered loudly, "What's a conspiracy?" And his mom said, "It's when someone makes up stuff because they don't want to admit they're wrong." Brutal, but accurate. Then came the paperwork. The officers began documenting the scene, taking photos of the car tracks, the damage, and interviewing witnesses. And let me tell you, the witnesses had no shortage of opinions. One neighbor eagerly pulled out his phone and said, "Officer, I got the whole thing on video. From the moment she swerved off the road to when she tried to blame the yard." Another chimed in, "Yeah, and last week she yelled at me for leaving my recycling bin out too long." You need to know this isn't her first stunt. Suddenly, it wasn't just about the crash. It was like the entire neighborhood had been waiting for this exact moment to unload years of Karen-related trauma. The cops listened patiently, jotting things down. Karen, meanwhile, was sulking near her car, arms crossed, muttering to herself. Every now and then she'd shout something like, "This is entrapment," or "I'm calling my lawyer." One officer leaned over to Dan and whispered, "Don't worry, sir. This isn't her liar's first rodeo." Dan cracked the tiniest smile, the first since this nightmare began. And here's where the humor really kicked in. While the officers were wrapping things up, Karen tried one last desperate move. She climbed back into her car and tried to start it again. But remember, her front bumper was still lodged halfway into Dan's yard. So when she revved the engine, the car made this horrible grinding noise and refused to move. Sparks flew from underneath. Smoke puffed out. And she just sat there, revving like she thought sheer willpower could free the car. The officer tapped on the window and said, "Ma'am, you're only making it worse." Karen shot back, "You're only making it worse," in the most childlike tone imaginable. At that point, even Dan laughed. The neighbors were doubled over. It was like watching a grown adult throw a tantrum in the middle of a parking lot. Now, here's a little personal aside. Watching Karen melt down over her car reminded me of this one time in college when my old roommate tried to microwave a frozen pizza. In the box. I kid you not. The whole dorm smelled like burnt cardboard for days. And when we called him out on it, he shouted, "It's not my fault. They shouldn't make boxes microwave-sized if you're not supposed to use them." That was my first taste of Karen logic in action. And let me tell you, it's alive and well in people like her. Back to the story. Eventually, the tow truck arrived. And oh man, the symbolism of that moment. Karen stood there, watching as the driver hooked chains to her car, lifted it up, and dragged it out of Dan's yard like a defeated prize fighter. The look on her face? A mix of rage, embarrassment, and disbelief. She actually shouted, "Don't scratch my car," as if the rose bushes she annihilated weren't worth mentioning. By now, the whole neighborhood was invested. Phones were still rolling. People were whispering about posting the videos online, and Karen was giving them all death stares that could curdle milk. But the reality was clear. She wasn't in control anymore. For once, the spotlight wasn't flattering, it was exposing. When the tow truck finally pulled away, Karen tried to storm back into her house. But the officers stopped her. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us for a formal statement," they said. She gasped like they'd just asked her to donate a kidney. "This is ridiculous. I'm the victim here," she shrieked. But the officers didn't budge. They escorted her to their car while she kept screaming about unfair treatment and neighborhood bullies. And just like that, the queen of drama was dethroned, at least for the night. The neighborhood exhaled, a collective sigh of relief. Dan looked at his destroyed yard, then at the crowd, and finally at the officers. "Well," he said, deadpan, "at least now I have an excuse to redo the landscaping." The crowd laughed, tension broken. But make no mistake, this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to go quietly, and the neighborhood knew it. Everyone could sense it. This was just round one. Karen sitting in the back of the police car should have been the end of it, right? Wrong. Because if there's one thing we all know about Karens, it's that they don't go down quietly. While the officer was finishing up the report with Dan, Karen was in the back seat shouting loud enough for the entire block to hear. "This is unlawful detention. I demand to speak to the mayor," she screeched, rattling the door handle like she thought it might magically open. The officer, calm as ever, leaned over and said, "Ma'am, this isn't a taxi. The doors don't open from the inside." The crowd chuckled, but Karen doubled down. "You think this is funny? You're all going to regret this. I have connections." Connections. That word hung in the air like a bad smell. Everyone in the neighborhood looked at each other, silently asking, "Connections to what? The HOA gardening committee?" Even Dan, exhausted and furious, shook his head. "The only thing you're connected to is a tow bill and a destroyed flower bed," he muttered under his breath. But here's the kicker. While Karen was trying to convince everyone she was some kind of big shot, the neighbors had started organizing. You know how sometimes chaos brings people together? Well, this was one of those times. A few folks who barely said more than hi to each other in passing were now swapping phone numbers, sharing their own Karen horror stories, and even talking about starting a community chat group. It was like Karen, in her quest to divide everyone, had accidentally united them. Meanwhile, Dan was still pacing, surveying the damage. His yard looked like a before picture from one of those home renovation shows. His wife came out, holding a mug of tea, and asked quietly, "Should we call the insurance company?" Dan just sighed. "Yeah, but what's the deductible on dealing with lunatics?" She smirked. "Hopefully they cover emotional distress too." The officers, bless their patience, were wrapping things up when Karen suddenly decided to go nuclear. From the back seat of the police car, she shouted, "If you people think this is over, you're wrong. I'll sue every single one of you. I'll sue the HOA, the neighbors, the landscaper, even the mailman." And right on cue, as if the universe was mocking her, the mailman walked by. He froze, looked at her screaming through the window, and then slowly backed away like, "Nope, not today." The whole neighborhood burst into laughter. It was the perfect sitcom moment. Now, this is where it gets even more interesting. One of the neighbors, a woman named Linda, stepped forward. She held up her phone and said, "I recorded the entire crash. And I've also got screenshots of all the nasty messages Karen has sent in the neighborhood Facebook group. Maybe it's time someone finally took action." The officers perked up. "Can you email that to us?" Linda nodded. "Gladly." Suddenly, Karen's threats didn't feel so intimidating anymore. Her connections were no match for hard evidence. Karen, realizing the shift, tried a different tactic. She pressed her face against the window of the police car and whined, "I'm just a single woman trying to live in peace. Everyone here has been bullying me for months." The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. A kid shouted from the crowd, "Lady, you yelled at me for riding my scooter on the sidewalk." The laughter came in waves. Here's the thing about stories like this. They don't just reveal who someone really is. They also reveal the strength of the people around them. Dan's neighbors, tired of being pushed around by Karen's antics, started speaking up one by one. "She reported me for having a wreath on my door that wasn't HOA approved," one man said. Another added, "She told me my dog barked too loud and threatened to call animal control." Suddenly, it wasn't just about a car crash. It was about years of bullying finally coming to light. The officer turned to Dan and asked, "Would you like to press charges for the property damage?" Dan didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." Karen gasped so loudly you'd think someone had told her Starbucks was out of pumpkin spice lattes. "This is revenge. You're all ganging up on me," she cried. "Now, let me pause here for a second and share something personal. This whole scene reminded me of my old neighbor growing up, Mr. Jenkins. He wasn't exactly a Karen, but he had that same energy, the kind of guy who would yell at kids for breathing too loud near his yard. One time, we accidentally tossed a football into his rose bushes. Instead of just giving it back, he held it hostage for a week and demanded we learn responsibility before he'd return it. And when he finally did, he handed it over like he was some kind of hero. Watching Karen scream about conspiracies and lawsuits brought me right back to that memory. Some people just thrive on drama. Anyway, back to the chaos. The tow truck driver came back over, wiping his hands, and said to Dan, "Don't worry, buddy. I've seen worse. At least it wasn't the pool." Dan blinked. "The pool?" The driver shrugged. "Yeah, once had to pull a car out of someone's swimming pool. Now that was a mess." Dan shook his head, muttering, "Small blessings, I guess." Karen, still fuming in the back of the squad car, suddenly started banging her head lightly against the window, chanting, "This isn't fair. This isn't fair." One of the officers, clearly done with the theatrics, said, "Ma'am, for your safety, please stop headbutting the glass." Karen groaned. "For my safety? What about my car's safety?" Everyone just stared. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the police began to wrap things up. They told Dan they'd file a full report, explained the process for pressing charges, and reassured him that his insurance would likely cover the damage. Karen, meanwhile, was being driven off, still shouting out the window like some kind of villain in a cartoon. "You haven't seen the last of me," she yelled, as the car slowly rolled down the street. Someone from the crowd yelled back, "Promise?" And the laughter that followed echoed through the entire block. As the flashing lights disappeared into the night, the neighbors lingered. They shared stories, traded contact info, and even talked about starting a neighborhood watch, not for crime, but specifically for Karen. Dan stood in the middle of his wrecked yard, surrounded by support, and for the first time that evening, he didn't feel alone. And here's the kicker. A few days later, that video Linda recorded, it went viral online, not just in the neighborhood, not just in the town, but across the internet. People everywhere were laughing at Karen's antics, shaking their heads at the absurdity, and cheering for Dan's patience. The neighborhood that had once been divided was now closer than ever. But deep down, everyone knew one thing. Karen wasn't gone for good. Oh no, she'd be back. And when she did, there'd be cameras ready, neighbors prepared, and a whole internet audience waiting for the next episode of Karen vs. Reality. A few days after the crash, the neighborhood was still buzzing. Dan's lawn had been patched up as best as possible, but the tire tracks, broken mailbox, and decapitated garden gnome were still reminders of what went down. Neighbors couldn't stop talking about it, at the mailbox, on walks, even in the local Facebook group. And guess what? Karen was back. Yep. Not in her car, because that was still in the shop, but strutting around like nothing happened. Sunglasses on, head held high, like she hadn't just made a viral fool of herself on the internet. People would look at her and whisper, "That's her, the crash lady." And she'd glare like she was about to file a defamation lawsuit against Oxygen itself. Dan, meanwhile, had been busy. With the help of Linda and the other neighbors, he'd submitted the police report, insurance claim, and, most importantly, filed charges for property damage. He wasn't going to let Karen just walk away this time. The neighborhood had suffered enough. The first court date came sooner than expected. Dan walked in with a folder full of evidence. Photos, videos, witness statements. Karen arrived late, of course, wearing what looked like her version of court chic. Oversized sunglasses, a leopard print scarf, and heels that clacked dramatically on the tile floor. She carried a massive binder labeled Karen's Evidence in big glittery stickers, like she thought she was about to deliver a TED talk. When the judge asked her to explain what happened, Karen launched into a speech that could have won her an Oscar for Most Dramatic Rewrite of Reality. According to her, Dan had intentionally sabotaged her car by planting dangerous decorative items in his yard, like gnomes and rose bushes. She claimed she swerved into his lawn to avoid a squirrel, and that the neighbors had conspired to frame her with fake videos. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you suggesting that an entire neighborhood staged a conspiracy involving landscaping, wildlife, and multiple smartphone cameras?" Karen slammed her glittery binder shut. "Exactly." At this point, even the court stenographer had to pause to stifle a laugh. Dan's lawyer, calm and collected, simply pulled out Linda's video, pressed play, and let the footage speak for itself. There was Karen, swerving off the road, crashing into the yard, refusing to get out of the car, and shouting about conspiracies. The courtroom chuckled. The judge sighed. Karen crossed her arms and muttered, "Deepfake." But the evidence didn't stop there. Neighbors had submitted text messages, HOA complaints, and even a video from the mailman's delivery cam that caught her shouting threats. One by one, the puzzle pieces fell into place, painting a picture of a woman who wasn't just reckless, but a chronic troublemaker. Karen's defense crumbled faster than her bumper. The judge ruled in Dan's favor, ordering Karen to pay for the damages, court costs, and even a small fine for wasting everyone's time. You'd think that would humble her, right? Wrong. As she stormed out of the courtroom, she shouted, "This isn't over. I'll appeal. I'll go to the Supreme Court if I have to." The security guard holding the door muttered, "Good luck with that," under his breath. Back in the neighborhood, Karen's reputation, what little was left, completely tanked. Parents warned their kids to avoid her. Dog walkers crossed the street when she came by. And every time she posted something in the HOA group chat, it got met with sarcastic GIFs. Someone even changed her nickname in the group to Crash Queen. Dan, on the other hand, became a bit of a local hero. People started waving when he walked his dog, dropping by to check on his yard, even inviting him and his wife to backyard barbecues. It was like the neighborhood realized that sticking together against chaos made life a whole lot better. But karma wasn't done yet. A few weeks later, Karen tried to throw a backyard party to prove she still had influence. She blasted music, put up tacky decorations, and invited people with flyers she slipped into mailboxes. Nobody showed up, not a single person. From across the street, Dan peeked through his blinds and saw her sitting alone at a table with a giant bowl of chips and a sad, half-deflated balloon that said, "Celebrate." And here's where it got truly poetic. The same tow truck driver who dragged her car out of Dan's yard drove by, honked, and shouted, "Nice turnout," before rolling away laughing. Karen screamed into the sky, fists raised, like a character in a soap opera. Now, I know this all sounds like the perfect ending, but let's be real, Karens never quit. They simmer, they plot, they find new ways to stir the pot. But here's the silver lining. Every time they try, karma has a way of showing up. Whether it's in the form of a tow truck, a courtroom, or an empty party, justice finds its moment. And for Dan and his neighbors, that was enough. They didn't need to fight every battle. Sometimes, just sitting back with popcorn and letting karma do the work was the sweetest revenge of all. So, what's the takeaway here? You can't always stop a Karen from being a Karen. But with patience, proof, and a little help from karma, you can make sure the truth comes out in the end. And if you've ever had a nightmare neighbor, you know exactly how satisfying that can feel. So if you enjoyed this wild ride of HOA drama, car crashes, and courtroom chaos, make sure to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and comment below with your own Karen story. Who knows? Yours might just be the next one we tell. After the courtroom drama, most people thought Karen might finally calm down, maybe even reflect on her life choices. But if you've been around Karens long enough, you know that calm down isn't in their vocabulary. Nope, if anything, Karen came back louder, bolder, and somehow even more ridiculous. It started small. She'd walk around the neighborhood with a notebook, scribbling furiously whenever she spotted something she didn't like. A slightly crooked mailbox? Write it down. A lawn that hadn't been mowed in exactly 5 days? Write it down. Kids drawing with chalk on the sidewalk? Write it down. The neighborhood started calling her the auditor, like she was some kind of self-appointed IRS agent for suburban life. Dan, though, had learned his lesson. Instead of letting her antics stress him out, he leaned back, sipped his coffee, and said, "She's just writing her memoirs. Confessions of a HOA Karen." His wife laughed so hard she almost spit out her tea. But Karen wasn't just annoying anymore. She was desperate. See, after losing in court and paying damages, she had a chip on her shoulder the size of Texas. She wanted revenge, and she wanted the neighborhood to feel her wrath. So what did she do? She started a petition to have Dan removed from the HOA. Yeah, you heard that right. The same guy whose yard she destroyed. She now wanted him kicked out for being a bad influence. She went door to door, binder in hand, demanding signatures. And the best part? Not a single person signed. In fact, most people slammed the door in her face, and a few even laughed. One neighbor, bless his soul, told her, "I'll sign if the petition is to ban you instead." Karen stormed off his porch so fast you'd think the ground was on fire. And here's where karma decided to double down. One evening, Karen was pacing her yard, muttering about conspiracies, when she tripped over her own garden hose. She went down with all the grace of a walrus on roller skates, right into her decorative bird bath. Splash! Water everywhere, hair soaked, sunglasses gone. And wouldn't you know it, 2 teenagers were walking by and caught the whole thing on video. By morning, Karen versus garden hose was trending in the neighborhood group chat. Dan couldn't stop laughing. He looked at his wife and said, "See? I told you, sometimes you just have to let karma handle it." Now, let me pause here for a personal story, because Karen's hose fiasco reminded me of something from my own life. Back in college, my roommate was obsessed with making instant noodles. One night, he decided to cook them without water. Yeah, just dry noodles, seasoning packet, and heat. 5 minutes later, the entire dorm smelled like burning plastic, and the fire alarm went off. When the RA asked him what happened, he said, "It's not my fault. They should write, 'Add water,' bigger on the package." That was pure Karen energy. And just like Karen, instead of admitting his mistake, he blamed the world. Anyway, back to our story. After the petition failed and the hose incident went viral, Karen became even more of an outcast. People avoided her at the grocery store. The HOA started ignoring her complaints, and even her so-called friends stopped inviting her to brunch. She was isolated, and honestly, it was all her own doing. Dan, meanwhile, had become the unofficial mayor of the block. People actually started looking up to him, not because he wanted the role, but because he'd stood up to Karen and won. Neighbors would ask for his advice, invite him to grill-outs, and joke about putting his face on the HOA newsletter. And here's the beautiful part. The neighborhood, once divided by petty squabbles, was now closer than ever. Families hung out more, kids played freely, and everyone seemed just a little happier. It was like Karen had accidentally done them a favor by being the common enemy. Of course, Karen being Karen, she couldn't stay quiet forever. One night, she decided to sneak into Dan's yard to inspect whether his new plants were HOA compliant. But guess what? Dan had installed security cameras after the crash. So the next morning, there was Karen, flashlight in hand, creeping through his rose bushes at 2 a.m., posted all over the neighborhood chat. The caption? Karen, HOA inspector by day, ninja by night. The comment section was ruthless. That video spread like wildfire, and pretty soon, Karen wasn't just a neighborhood meme. She was a full-blown internet sensation. People across the country were laughing at her antics, calling her the suburban menace, and making parody TikToks about her. She wanted power, but all she got was notoriety. And honestly, that's the most satisfying kind of justice. She didn't just lose the battle, she lost her image, her credibility, and whatever shred of influence she thought she had left. For Dan and the neighbors, life went on. His yard was restored, his mailbox rebuilt, and yes, he even replaced the decapitated garden gnome with a new one, this time bigger, brighter, and with a little sign that said, "Protected by Karma." Every time he walked past it, he smiled. And for Karen? Well, she still lurked around, muttering about conspiracies and plotting her next move. But nobody took her seriously anymore. She was just background noise, the cautionary tale of what happens when entitlement meets karma. So here's the big takeaway. Sometimes the best revenge isn't yelling or fighting or even dragging someone to court. Sometimes the best revenge is patience. Sit back, sip your coffee, and let karma do its thing. Because trust me, it always does. And if you've ever dealt with a Karen, or you've got a wild HOA story of your own, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments below, and who knows? Your story might be the next one I share. Oh, and don't forget, if you enjoyed this wild ride, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another story of drama, karma, and sweet justice. Because let's be honest, in a world full of Karens, we all need a little reminder that karma never skips a beat. Karen's reputation had sunk lower than the broken mailbox she'd destroyed, but if you thought she'd learn from her mistakes, oh no, you don't know Karen. See, Karens don't process failure like normal people. Normal people would take a step back, reflect, maybe apologize. But Karen? She doubled down. It all started one Saturday morning. The neighborhood was calm. Kids were riding bikes, sprinklers were hissing, and Dan was finally enjoying a quiet cup of coffee on his porch. For the first time in weeks, things felt normal. But then came the sound, that unmistakable high-pitched shriek echoing down the street. "You can't park there. That's my spot." Everyone froze. It was like hearing a tornado siren. You just knew trouble was coming. Turns out, a delivery driver had pulled up in front of Karen's house to drop off a package. Totally normal, right? Wrong. Karen came storming out of her house in slippers, waving her arms like she was directing traffic at the Indy 500. The poor driver looked confused. "Ma'am, I'm just delivering an Amazon package." But Karen wasn't having it. "No, that curb belongs to me. This is trespassing." By this point, half the neighborhood had peeked out their windows. Dan, sipping his coffee, muttered, "Here we go again." The driver, bless his patience, handed over the package and said, "Ma'am, I'll be gone in 2 minutes." But Karen, in full meltdown mode, whipped out her phone and started recording. "This is harassment. You're targeting me," she yelled. The driver, deadpan, replied, "Lady, I don't even know who you are." That one had Dan laughing so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. And just like that, another Karen incident was born. Neighbors filmed, screenshots circulated, and by evening, Amazon Karen was trending in the community chat. Someone even made a meme. A picture of Karen pointing angrily with the caption, "You can't prime here." Now, here's the thing. Normally, these incidents would stress people out, but the neighborhood had changed. Instead of feeling divided and bullied, they were united. Karen had accidentally created a community, not through kindness, but through shared suffering. People were closer than ever, and they found joy in laughing at her ridiculous antics. Dan especially had taken on the role of unofficial narrator. Anytime Karen went off, he'd mutter commentary under his breath like a sports announcer. And here comes Karen, storming onto the field, binder in hand, yelling at the ref. "Oh wait, no ref, just a poor delivery guy." His wife rolled her eyes, but secretly loved it. But Karen wasn't done. No, she wanted revenge. So she came up with her boldest plan yet, organizing her own HOA meeting. Except she didn't actually have permission. She printed out flyers, slipped them into mailboxes, and invited everyone to Karen's HOA summit, Restoring Order. On the night of the summit, she decorated her living room with folding chairs, snacks, and a giant whiteboard that said, Karen's Rules for a Better Neighborhood. Only 3 people showed up, 2 curious teenagers looking for free chips and 1 guy who thought it was a poker night. Still, Karen gave her presentation with all the seriousness of a presidential address. She ranted about overgrown lawns, sidewalk chalk terrorism, and of course, Dan's criminal garden gnomes. The teens filmed the whole thing, and by the next morning, clips of her summit were all over TikTok. The internet had a field day. Dan couldn't believe it. She's basically making herself famous, he said, shaking his head. His wife smirked. Famous for what though? Being the world's most dedicated complainer? Now, here's a little personal aside because this moment reminded me of something. Back in high school, I had this one teacher who was obsessed with enforcing the most random rules. Like, you couldn't chew gum in class because, according to her, gum disrupts brainwaves. She'd give 15-minute lectures on the dangers of bubblegum while ignoring kids actually throwing paper airplanes. Watching Karen host her fake HOA meeting felt exactly like that. Lots of rules, zero logic. Anyway, back to Karen. After her summit flopped, she tried a new tactic: guilt tripping. She posted long rants in the HOA group chat about how the neighborhood was toxic, how nobody respected her, and how she was the only one fighting for order. People responded with GIFs of clowns, tumbleweeds, and my personal favorite, Kermit sipping tea. And then, the final straw. Karen, desperate for attention, decided to install a giant banner on her lawn that read, "This neighborhood is corrupt. Justice for Karen." She even added flashing Christmas lights around it for dramatic effect. The HOA finally had enough. They called an emergency meeting, not at Karen's house this time, but at the community center. Dozens of neighbors showed up, ready to put an end to the madness once and for all. Dan sat in the front row, calm and collected, like a man preparing for the season finale of his favorite show. When Karen walked in, binder in hand, she looked ready to fight. But this time, she wasn't the star. The neighbors were. One by one, they spoke up about her harassment, her false reports, her chaos. Linda presented her video evidence again. The mailman testified about her constant complaints, and even the delivery driver sent in a written statement. The HOA board didn't take long to decide. Karen was fined heavily for misconduct, stripped of any HOA privileges, and warned that further incidents could lead to legal consequences. The look on her face? Pure defeat. She tried to argue, of course, waving her binder and shouting about conspiracies. But nobody listened anymore. The power she once thought she had? Gone. And that, my friends, was the beginning of the end. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't just surviving Karen. They were thriving despite her. Block parties started happening again. Kids played without fear of being yelled at, and Dan finally rebuilt his yard with a brand new set of garden gnomes. This time, he added a little sign in front of them that read, "Protected by public opinion." Karen? Well, she still lurked, still muttered, still plotted. But now, nobody cared. She was noise in the background, a reminder of chaos past, and honestly, the neighborhood was better for it. It had been weeks since the HOA handed down their judgment against Karen. The fines, the warnings, the public humiliation. It was all supposed to calm her down. But if there's one thing we've learned, it's that Karens don't fade quietly into the night. Oh no. They go out swinging, clawing, and screaming until karma finally pulls the curtain. Karen had been quieter than usual, which worried the neighbors. Everyone knew the silence meant she was plotting. Dan joked with Linda, "It's the calm before the Karen storm." And he was right. The storm arrived on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The neighborhood was hosting its first real block party since all the chaos began. Grills were sizzling, kids were running around with water balloons, music was playing, life finally felt normal again. Dan looked around and smiled, thinking, "We earned this." But just as people started dancing, a familiar voice screeched from the end of the street. You're all violating noise ordinances. This party is illegal." Heads turned, and there she was, Karen, marching down the street with her glittery binder, a bullhorn in one hand, and, I kid you not, a stack of printed citations she had made on her home printer. She started handing them out like Oprah giving away cars. "You get a fine. You get a fine. Everyone gets a fine." The neighbors tried to ignore her, but Karen wasn't having it. She stormed up to the DJ booth, well, really just a Bluetooth speaker on a folding table, and yanked the cord. The music cut off, and the whole block went silent. Karen smirked like she had just won a war. But then, something amazing happened. Instead of arguing, the crowd started clapping, slow at first, then louder and louder, until it drowned out her bullhorn. Someone shouted, "Karen, Karen," like it was a joke chant at a sports game. Others joined in, laughing, clapping, until Karen realized the entire neighborhood wasn't scared of her anymore. They were mocking her. Her face turned beet red. She waved her binder in the air, shouting about legal repercussions and class action lawsuits. But her words were swallowed by laughter. Even the kids were chanting, "Karen, Karen, Karen," while chasing each other with water balloons. That's when karma delivered its final blow. Remember Karen's car? The one she crashed into Dan's yard? Well, she had finally gotten it back from the shop. She had parked it on the street that day, right behind the block party. And as she ranted into her bullhorn, a water balloon fight broke out nearby. One balloon went flying, missed its target, and splattered right across her freshly polished windshield. Karen shrieked. She spun around, stomped toward the car, and in her rage, slipped on a patch of spilled soda. Binder flew into the air, bullhorn hit the ground, and she landed right in the middle of a kiddie pool. The crowd gasped for half a second, and then erupted into laughter. There she was, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, dripping wet, binder pages floating around her like confetti, sitting in a rainbow kiddie pool while kids laughed and dogs barked. It was poetic. Karen scrambled out, soaked and furious, shouting, "This isn't over." But her words didn't carry the same weight anymore. People were recording on their phones, some even live streaming. By the next morning, the video titled "Karen vs. Kiddie Pool Karma" had gone viral, racking up thousands of views. And that, my friends, was the end. Karen stopped showing up at HOA meetings. She stopped patrolling the streets with her binder. She still lived there, sure, but her power was gone. Every time she opened her mouth, people just smirked, remembering the kiddie pool incident. She had become a punchline, a cautionary tale, a reminder that when you push too far, karma pushes back harder. As for the neighborhood, it thrived. Dan rebuilt his yard completely, adding flowers, a brand new mailbox, and yes, a fresh army of gnomes. This time, the gnomes weren't just decoration. They were a symbol, a little army standing guard, reminding everyone of the chaos they survived together. Block parties became a tradition. The neighbors grew closer, stronger, and more supportive. And Dan, sipping his coffee one morning, thought about how sometimes the worst situations bring out the best in people. All it takes is one Karen to make a community realize how much stronger they are when they stand united. So, what's the lesson here? You can't control what people like Karen do, but you can control how you respond. You can choose laughter over fear, unity over division, and patience over chaos. Because in the end, karma always finds its way, and trust me, it has a sense of humor. And hey, if you enjoyed this roller coaster of HOA drama, Karen chaos, and ultimate karma justice, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and share your own Karen stories in the comments below. Who knows? Maybe your story will be the next one we tell. After the kiddie pool incident, things finally settled down. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer, almost as if a storm cloud had drifted away. People still talked about Karen, of course, but now it was with laughter instead of dread. On walks, you'd hear snippets like, "Remember the look on her face when she slipped?" or "Best block party ever." Even the mailman, who'd endured months of Karen's complaints, started whistling again on his route. The community had survived the chaos, and in the process, discovered a new strength. Dan, sitting on his porch one evening with a cold drink, looked out at his repaired lawn, and thought about everything that had happened. It was insane, exhausting, and at times downright hilarious. But it also taught him, and everyone else, an important truth. Sometimes the people who cause the most chaos also give us the biggest reasons to come together. And Karen? Well, she never fully disappeared. You'd still see her walking her tiny yapping dog, or peering out her blinds like a neighborhood spy. But the fear was gone. Nobody took her seriously anymore. If she muttered about conspiracies or unlawful gnomes, people just smiled, waved, and went about their day. She had lost the power she once thought she had. The best part? Her Karen versus Kitty Pool video didn't just go viral locally, it blew up online. Strangers from across the country commented things like, "That's karma in 4K," and "I've never rooted for garden gnomes this hard in my life." Some even made remixes of her falling into the pool, complete with dramatic music. Karen had accidentally become internet famous for all the wrong reasons. And you know what? That was poetic justice. Now, let me pull this into something personal, because watching Karen's saga reminded me of a story from my own life. Years ago, I lived in an apartment building with my own version of Karen. Let's call her Elevator Karen. This woman would stand guard by the lobby elevator like it was her personal security checkpoint. Every time someone came in with groceries, she'd demand to know if they were blocking access. If you so much as pressed the door hold button to help a neighbor, she'd freak out, saying, "That's against fire code." One time, I carried a pizza upstairs and she accused me of violating odor regulations. I mean, come on, what does that even mean? But here's the kicker. One night, she tried to lecture a delivery driver who was unloading packages in the lobby. She ranted about clutter and trip hazards, waving her arms dramatically. Right in the middle of her speech, she tripped over one of the very boxes she was yelling about and landed, face first, in a pile of bubble wrap. The driver and I locked eyes, trying not to laugh. But then she popped one of the bubbles as she stood up, and we lost it. It was like karma wrapped itself in plastic just for her. And from that day on, people in the building started calling her Bubble Wrap Karen. The point is, whether it's Bubble Wrap Karen, Elevator Karen, or HOA Karen, they all teach us the same lesson. You can't control other people's madness, but you can control how you deal with it. Sometimes you fight, sometimes you laugh, and sometimes you just grab popcorn and let karma do its job. Back to Dan's neighborhood. Things flourished in ways they hadn't before. Kids drew chalk art without fear, families hosted cookouts, and neighbors actually smiled when they saw each other. The chaos had turned into comedy, the stress into stories, and the division into unity. One evening, Dan hosted a little gathering in his backyard. Just a casual get-together, grilled burgers, lemonade, music. As the sun set, Linda raised a glass and said, "To surviving Karen." Everyone laughed and clinked glasses. And then Dan added, "To thriving because of Karen." And that's the twist, isn't it? The very thing that caused so much drama ended up making the neighborhood stronger than ever. Now, if you've watched this whole story unfold, here's my message to you. Maybe you've got your own Karen in your life, a neighbor, a coworker, maybe even a family member who stirs chaos just for the sake of it. And maybe they make you want to scream sometimes. But here's the good news. Karma's patient. Karma's funny. And sooner or later, it shows up. So, the next time you deal with a Karen moment, remember Dan, remember the garden gnomes, and remember the kiddie pool. Because justice doesn't always wear a robe and a gavel. Sometimes it wears swim trunks and shows up at a block party. And before we wrap this up, I've got one last call to action for you. If you enjoyed this saga of chaos, comedy, and karma, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your craziest neighbor story. Who knows? Your tale of HOA horror or office Karen drama might just be the next story we bring to life here. Because let's be real, life's too short not to laugh at the madness. And with a little patience, a little humor, and a lot of karma, justice always finds its way.